One of the advantages of keeping in touch with so many of you going through these rather intense interviewing experiences is that I receive a ton of feedback linked to various elements of this interviewing process. But more interestingly, for today's video, what do you wish you could have done better going through this interview? And I'm going to structure this by mentioning three elements: first for the telephone screening round, and then for the on-site interview. So the number one feedback that I receive of people wishing they'd prepare better for a phone interview is that they wish they had a better answer for "tell me about yourself." So talking about yourself should be something that you prepare in advance, and to my knowledge, a majority of candidates do actually prepare for these things. So some simple clues here would be: you should always focus on your strengths and first identify your strength and your true strength, not the one that you think looks best for the job description that you're applying for. And of course, keep in mind some of the main highlights from your career. The second element that I want to talk about going into a telephone screening round is that many people are surprised by how not interesting their answers sound during the actual interview. So what happens here is that often you prepare a lot, you brainstorm a lot over what you will say during the interview, but when it comes to actually speaking your answer, actually communicating your answer, it doesn't sound as exciting as you would have hoped. And the best cure I know for this would be to simply split the preparation process: 50% brainstorming, 50% role-playing your answers, and ensuring they sound good. And it's often time that if they sound good to you, they also sound good in a telephone screen. Or if you're not sure, ask someone to help you with this thing. And finally, the third element I want to talk about here is that many people report that they were surprised about the level of detail that the interviewer was interested in when it comes to one of their projects or one of their assignments. So try to remember as many metrics as possible for the projects from your CV. Maybe remember the financials, maybe remember the timelines involved, but this is time well spent according to the feedback that I receive. All right, now going to the on-site interview, the number one feedback that I received is that people felt like they employed the same story too many times. So what happens is some people prepare 3 to 5 stories for a 5 to 6 hour on-site interview. And it's inevitable that you would have to spin out the same story over and over again. What you don't know is that they would also take notes of these stories, and they will corroborate these notes after your interview, and it will easily show that, hey, this guy has a rather limited experience that he wants to talk about, and this is obviously a question mark. Now, the cure for this, the fix for this would be to prepare 15 to 20 high-quality such stories, and even if you haven't worked on 15 to 20 huge projects or huge assignments in your career, you could easily zoom in and zoom out of a situation to make it sound like a specific story. So it's all about knowing what you're after here when compared to having the necessary content. So everyone has it, you just have to prepare it here. The second most common feedback that I receive on people that I wish they could have done better for an on-site interview is the quality of the failure stories that they tell. So it's very unlikely not to get asked for a failure story in an on-site interview nowadays with a high-performing company. And how you often find out that your story is not the best one is when the interviewer is trying to deep probe each and every element of your story. The most common way to test this would be to quantify the failure in a certain way. If you cannot quantify, or if it's tricky to quantify, then that's a question mark when it comes to that failure story. And there's another interviewing technique around false positives that they try to deep probe as much as possible the harder questions in order to try to see how negative you will get. speaking about these things. And what happens with some candidates is that once they have a not so good answer, they tend to react the same for all subsequent questions during that 1 hour interview. So you should be very careful on preparing high quality stories and being confident on yourself that these are great stories. And by the way, for the failure stories, 3 to 5 separate failure stories is where you want to be for a 5 or 6 hour intense on-site interview. At least that's my recommendation. And finally, number 3 here is that I still hear of people who forget to prepare questions for the interviewers. And this wouldn't be such a big issue in a phone interview where there's only one interviewer, so you could probably get away with it. But when there's 5 or 6 of them, and each of them would ask you for 2 or 3 questions for them, the probability that you will ask them some boring questions increases. And if you don't ask them interesting questions, it's not likely that you will score high for that specific interview. And usually the difference is often made on the details with these things. So that's why you want to prepare. I would highly recommend 8 to 10 such questions to show them that you really care about the business. And this is something not as straightforward as it sounds, but you must really convince them that you really want the job here. So that's why the quality of the stories you would want to ask is a differentiator. For example, what type of people do well here would be a question that I heard recently, and I really recommend that you would consider also for your interview. So as you can see here, there's a lot of stuff to prepare for, and I'm sure your time is either rather limited. But I believe that by knowing this type of information, it's often that you can further tailor your preparation to eventually come up with the strongest possible answers and ultimately put together a great show.